With only hours left to live, his final request stunned everyone. It wasn't for a last meal. It wasn't for a phone call. He asked to see his dog one last time. But in that final goodbye, his dog did something that would silence the prison, freeze the guards, and unravel a truth buried for years. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in a place like Stonehaven State Penitentiary on a morning like this. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's a heavy, thick silence, filled with ghosts of regrets and the ticking of unseen clocks. The air itself feels dense, every sound swallowed by the weight of what is to come. The clink of a key in a lock isn't just a sound. It's a hammer blow. The echo of boots on the cold, concrete floor isn't just a step. It's a countdown. And in a cell tucked away from the world, a man named Ethan sat waiting. He wasn't a man who had arrived here 7 years ago. That man had been all sharp edges and defiant anger, a storm raging against the injustice he swore had trapped him. But time, in a place like Stonehaven, is a master sculptor. It doesn't just pass, it carves. It had smoothed Ethan's edges, hollowed out his cheeks, and etched lines of resignation around his eyes. Now, on the edge of his thin cot, he was just still. His hands, once clenched into fists, rested loosely in his lap. His gaze was fixed on the floor, but he wasn't really seeing the cold, gray stone. He was seeing a life that had ended long before this day had even begun. The guards who came for him were different, too. Their usual briskness was softened by a grim solemnity. There's a protocol for this day, a script everyone follows. There's a final meal, the final phone call, the final words. They expected Ethan to follow the script. They'd seen it all, the last-minute bravado, the tearful breakdowns, the desperate prayers. The warden himself came to the cell door. He was a large man, not unkind, but shaped by decades of hard choices. "Ethan," he said, his voice low, "it's time. Do you have any last requests?" The question hung in the air. A last meal? A final call to a family who had long since stopped visiting? A letter to be delivered? Ethan looked up, and for the first time that morning, his eyes held a flicker of something other than emptiness. It was a deep, aching need. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, but steady. "I want to see Max," he said. "My dog." A pause. You could see the confusion on the faces of the men standing there. A dog? In all their years, they had never heard such a thing. A condemned man, hours from his end. And he doesn't ask for a priest or a loved one. He asked for his dog. But for Ethan, Max wasn't just a pet. Max was the last thread connecting him to the person he used to be. Before the arrest, before the trial, before the world decided he was a monster and turned its back, there was Max. A loyal, goofy German shepherd with ears too big for his head and a heart too big for his body. Max had slept at the foot of his bed, greeted him with a wagging tail after a long day, and had looked at it with eyes that held no judgment, only unwavering devotion. In his final hours, Ethan didn't want forgiveness from people who couldn't give it. He didn't want to explain himself. He just wanted to feel one last time what it was like to be looked at with pure love. Back in the control room, the debate began. "It's a security risk," one officer argued. "We've never allowed an animal in here. It's unprecedented." But an older officer, a man named Evans who had been at Stonehaven almost as long as the warden, spoke up. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension. "That dog is all he has left," Evans said. "No one has visited him in 5 years. No letters. Nothing. The man has been a model prisoner. No trouble. Maybe we can let him have this one piece." The warden sighed, steepling his fingers. He requested Ethan's file. He read through the personal notes. Owner of one German shepherd, named Max Dog, was seized at time of arrest. He looked at Ethan's clean record, the 7 years of quiet compliance. After a long, heavy silence, the warden nodded. "All right," he said. "Make the arrangements. Under strict supervision. The yard only. 10 minutes. That's it." Word spread to the prison like a current. A condemned man was saying goodbye to his dog. Some guards shook their heads, unable to understand it. But others, the ones who had pets waiting for them at home, they understood. They whispered about the bond, a love that doesn't need words. For Ethan, the walk to the yard was an eternity. The cuffs on his wrists felt heavier than ever, but his heart was pounding with a nervous, fragile energy. He was led to the center of the vast, empty yard. A single metal chair sat under the pale, morning sky. He stood a few feet from it, his eyes locked on the heavy gate at the far end. His entire world had shrunk to this moment, to the anticipation of a familiar face. Then the gate creaked open, and there he was. Max trotted in, his black and tin coat gleaming. An officer held his leash, but it was clear Max was in charge. His ears pricked forward, his nose twitched, and then he saw Ethan. His whole body froze for a second, processing. Then his tail began to move, a slow, tentative wag at first, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Then it gained speed, a joyful, frantic metronome, thumping against the sides. A low whine escaped his throat, a sound tangled with excitement and confusion. The officer glanced at the warden, who gave a single, curt nod. The leash went slack. Max didn't run. He surged. A powerful, loving missile aimed straight at Ethan's heart. Ethan dropped to his knees just in time. The dog slammed into him, burying his head into Ethan's shoulder, whining and licking any patch of skin he could find. Ethan wrapped his cuffed hands around the dog's strong neck, burying his face in a familiar, musky scent of his fur. It smelled of earth and sunshine and a home he thought he'd lost forever. In that moment, the walls of Stonehaven vanished. The countdown to his death stopped. There were no guards, no sentences, no wrongs or rights. There was only a man and his dog, finally together again. He remembered everything. The clumsy puppy tripping over his own paws. The long walks in the woods, Max chasing squirrels. The quiet nights when the dog's steady breathing was the only thing that could calm the storms in his mind. But then, something shifted. Max froze. His joyful wiggling stopped dead. His body went rigid against Ethan's chest. The happy whines were cut off, replaced by a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through Ethan's entire body. It was a sound Ethan had only heard a handful of times in his life, a sound of pure, instinctual warning. Ethan pulled back slightly. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's okay. It's just me." But it wasn't okay. Max wasn't looking at him anymore. The dog's head was turned, his ears pinned flat, his gaze locked like a laser on a man standing about 10 feet away. Officer Miller, a tall, stern guard who always seemed to have a permanent frown etched on his face. A deep, menacing growl now rolled from Max's chest, a sound that seemed to silence the very birds in the sky beyond the walls. He bared his teeth, a silent, deadly promise. The guard shifted uneasily. "Control your dog," one of them muttered, taking a step forward. But Ethan's mind was racing, the warm haze of the reunion evaporating in an instant. He knew this dog. Max was friendly to a fault. He'd never, ever growled at a person without a reason. A very good reason. Officer Miller avoided looking directly at Max, but Ethan saw his jaw tighten, a muscle twitching in his cheek. For the first time that morning, a new feeling stirred in Ethan's chest. It wasn't hope. It was something darker, more urgent. Curiosity. Suspicion. Why? Why would Max, in this moment of overwhelming joy, focus such pure hatred on this one man? As the officers began to lead a still growling Max away, Officer Evans, the man who had spoken up for him, approached Ethan. His voice was barely a whisper. "Your dog, he's got a good nose, doesn't he?" Evans asked, his eyes darting toward where Miller had been standing. "What's his problem with Miller?" Ethan, careful not to show too much, just shook his head. Max doesn't growl at strangers for fun. Officer Evans frowned, a deep line forming between his brows. "Funny thing," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I was just looking at the old arrest report. Miller was on duty that night you were brought in, but his name's not on the log. He never reported being there." The words landed on Ethan like a physical blow. If Miller was there that night, why would he hide it? As if summoned by the conversation, Officer Miller reappeared at the far end of the yard. Instantly, Max, who was being led away, erupted. He lunged against his leash, barking and snarling with a fury that was terrifying to behold. His focus on Miller was absolute, unbreakable. Officer Evans's eyes narrowed. He looked from a frantic dog to the stoic guard, and then back to Ethan. The unspoken question hung in the heavy prison air, charged and dangerous. This wasn't just a goodbye anymore. The 10-minute reunion was over. But something else had just begun. And if Max was right, and Ethan knew, with every fiber of his being, that he was, then this prison yard hadn't been a place of endings. It was about to become the ground where a long-buried truth would finally start to fight its way into the light. The walk back to his cell was nothing like the walk out. Before, Ethan's world had been a narrow tunnel, focused only on the hope of a wet nose and a wagging tail. Now, that tunnel had exploded into a chaotic landscape of questions. Every echo of the guard's boots sounded like a question. The clang of the cell door sliding shut behind him was not the sound of an ending, but a terrifying, uncertain beginning. Max was gone, led away still tense and unhappy. But his presence lingered in the cell like a ghost. Ethan could still smell the faint, comforting scent of dog on his jumpsuit. He could still feel the phantom weight of that loyal head on his shoulder. And he could still hear that growl, a sound that cracked the solid foundation of the last 7 years. Hope is a dangerous thing in a place like Stonehaven. For so long, Ethan had locked it away, knowing it was a poison more painful than despair. But now, against his will, a tiny, stubborn seed of it had been planted. It wasn't the hope of freedom. That was too vast, too impossible to consider. It was a smaller, sharper hope, the hope of being believed. For 7 years, everyone had looked at him and seen a murderer. But Max had looked at Officer Miller and seen something wrong. And a dog's instincts, Ethan knew, didn't care about court transcripts or circumstantial evidence. They only cared about the truth. Meanwhile, Officer Evans stood in the prison's records room, a place that smelled of old paper and dust. The clock was still ticking, a relentless reminder that in a few hours, a man would die. But the image of that dog, snarling with such targeted fury, wouldn't leave him. He pulled the file for Ethan's arrest night, his fingers leaving trails in the thin layer of dust. The official log showed a routine arrest, but Evans remembered snippets, whispers from years ago. Miller had been acting strangely that week, on edge. And he'd definitely been at the station that night, his uniform damp, his knuckles scraped, though he claimed he'd been off duty. Evans found the witness list. There was only one, a neighbor who had heard the argument. But as he sifted through the evidence bags logged that night, his heart skipped a beat. There was an item, a small silver pocket knife found at the scene, tagged as belonging to Ethan. But Evans remembered Ethan. He was a carpenter. His knife had a distinct, hand-carved wooden handle. This one was plain metal, a generic, cheap thing. At the time, no one had questioned it. The case had seemed so clear-cut. Now, everything felt fragile, like a house of cards. Evans knew what he had to do. It was a risk that could cost him his job, but the sound of Max's growl was a command he felt compelled to obey. He went to the warden. "Sir," he said, his voice tight, "we have a problem." An hour later, Ethan was brought not to his cell, but to a small, brightly lit interview room. He was still in cuffs. And sitting in the corner, calm now but watchful, was Max. The warden had allowed it. The dog's presence, he realized, was now part of the evidence. Officer Evans stood by the door, and across the table, his face a mask of cold anger, sat Officer Miller. The warden's voice was grave. "Miller, we're revisiting the night of crime. The log says you were off duty, but there are inconsistencies. Why were you at the scene?" Miller's eyes were flat, his posture rigid. "I told you, I was passing by. Heard the commotion. Didn't think it was important to report. It was a chaotic night." As he spoke, Max, who had been resting his head on his paws, lifted it. A low growl started deep in his chest. It was a direct response to the sound of Miller's voice. Miller flinched, his eyes darting toward the dog, before snapping back to the warden. "Control that animal," he snapped. Evans spoke up. "It's funny you say you were just passing by, because a witness has just come forward. Someone who lived a few houses down. They remember seeing a man in a guard's uniform, a man matching your description. leaving Ethan's house almost an hour before the first police car arrived. Miller's mask cracked. A flicker of panic showed in his eyes. "That's a lie." "Who? Who said that?" "That doesn't matter right now," the warden said, his eyes narrowing. He looked from Miller's panicked face to Max, who was now on his feet, his body tense, a steady, threatening rumble emanating from him. The dog's focus was absolute. He was pointing, as clearly as if he'd spoken, at the guilty man in the room. The warden took a deep breath. The pieces were falling into a terrible, clear picture. A dog's unwavering reaction. A missing log entry. A new witness. A piece of evidence that never quite fit. "The execution is stayed," the warden announced, his voice echoing in the small room. "Effective immediately. This case is being reopened." For Ethan, the words didn't feel real. It was as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. The stay of execution wasn't freedom, but it was oxygen. It was a chance. He looked at Max, and the dog, sensing the shift, finally broke his stare at Miller and looked at Ethan. His tail gave a tentative wag. The bond between them, the very thing that was supposed to be a final comfort, had become a lifeline. What followed was a whirlwind. The official investigation moved with a speed that was dizzying. The new witness gave a formal statement. The pocket knife was retested for fingerprints. The results were definitive. The prints on the knife did not belong to Ethan. They belonged to Officer Miller. As the days turned into weeks, the whole ugly truth unraveled. Miller had been involved in a side business that the victim had discovered. There had been a confrontation. It had turned violent. Miller, panicking, had used his knowledge of Ethan, a man who lived alone, who kept himself, to frame him. He'd planted the knife, ensured he was part of the arresting team, and used his position to steer the investigation away from himself. The prosecution, faced with the new evidence, dropped all charges against Ethan. The morning he was released, the sky outside the gates of Stonehaven was a brilliant, shocking blue. The air smelled clean, of rain and growing things. Ethan walked out wearing the same clothes he'd worn in 7 years ago. They hung loosely on his thinner frame. There were no cameras, no cheering crowds. Just the quiet, monumental fact of his freedom. And there, waiting by a car with Officer Evans, was Max. The dog saw him and strained at his leash, his entire body wriggling with joy so pure it was almost painful to watch. Evans smiled, a real, genuine smile, and let him go. This time, there were no chains on Ethan's wrists, no guards flanking him, no walls looming overhead. He dropped to his knees on the warm asphalt, and Max crashed into him, covering his face in happy, slobbery kisses. Ethan buried his face in the dog's fur, and for the first time, he let the tears come. They were tears for 7 lost years of pain, but mostly they were tears of gratitude. "We made it, boy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You did it. You never gave up on me." The world outside was loud and big and unfamiliar. Cars rushed by. People hurried past on their way to ordinary lives. But Ethan wasn't afraid. He had his compass. He had his best friend. He stood up, and together, man and dog began to walk away from the prison. Their footsteps were light, on the free ground. Ethan wasn't a man who had been defined by a crime he didn't commit. He was a man his dog had always known he was, loyal, loved, and worthy of a second chance. This story reminds us that the most powerful truths are often wordless. They don't come from a lawyer's eloquent argument or a judge's gavel. Sometimes, the truth has a wet nose, a wagging tail, and a memory that never fades. It's the truth that lives in the heart of a creature who teaches us that love isn't about what's easy. It's about what's real. And that kind of love can silence a prison, freeze a guard in his tracks, and ultimately unlock the door to freedom. Ethan and Max's journey shows us that hope can be found in the most unexpected places. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What incredible bonds are happening around us right now? If this story touched your heart, please give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more of these powerful stories with the world.